So Johanna is an associate professor at the University of Umeå in the north of, well, I call it the north, but there's still lots of it up in Sweden. And she's a researcher in education of science and engineering, but she chose a very interesting angle to this, and which is to study how emotions influence the way you learn, and this is particularly important in topics such as sustainability, both environmental and social, because you tackle these very wicked problems. And so she has been working on this, and there are really several elements that make her work so special. One which I think really gives the depth and the weight to this research is that it's very anchored into theory and concepts, which help address the exact proper question and to go deep into it. Then it's very actionable, so it's very focused on how practitioners can actually implement and how to help students that learn their basic topics to include these aspects of emotions and related topics. One that's key and very well illustrated here is the fact that it has to be international, because I think both your team and the network you have created during COVID, which is quite an accomplishment, we never know where our students are going to work, somewhere in the world, so we all need to do it together. It was mentioned during the introduction. So thanks a lot for coming, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Gizu, and thank you everyone who is making this conference possible. I can't tell you how much of a pleasure and privilege it is to be here. That's not just because of my leg, but also because I could never dream that we would talk about emotions at a large international engineering education conference. So I'm really, really happy to be able to be here with you today. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. We call it the outline. I call it the cognitive guardrail to reduce the risk of you feeling confused or lost during my talk, because I'm talking about emotions. So I'm going to try to convince you that emotions are a thing in engineering education, even though some people still pretend they're not. I'm going to try to talk about how we can research emotions in engineering education and how we can do it better. And then I'm going to tell you what's up with these ribbons that you got when you registered. First of all, what are emotions? Well, it's not that easy, because there is actually no agreement on what emotions are in research. There's many different definitions, and different disciplines use different approaches. But there's some elements that most emotion researchers agree on. And that is that emotions are relatively short, episodic things. So it's not about days or months or years, like moods can be. You can be depressed for a long time. But it's about maybe minutes or hours. And the other part that most researchers agree on is that emotions consist of multiple components. One of them is the bodily functions, the neurophysiology, like our heart rate, we start sweating, we start having hormones that influence how we behave and our bodily functions. The second one is the motor expression, what we do with our hands, our face, our body to express emotions to others. Then we have the subjective feeling, which really is the experience, our experience of the emotions we are having. Cognitive evaluation means that our emotions are a response to something that happens around us, something we encounter, and we evaluate that what we encounter as positive or negative, and depending on how we evaluate it, we will respond with different emotions. And then the last part is the motivation. Evolutionarily, emotions are meant to make us do things, to survive. So they motivate us to act in specific ways. Now I'm going to tell you a short story about an experience I had of having the wrong emotions. This picture is me in 1997 during my first ever music competition. I played the harp for 3 years, and I practiced for a year, an hour a day, blisters all over my fingers. I really wanted to do well, and I did well. A few hours before the prize ceremony that evening, a father of one of my friends called, and he had some inside information, and he said, "You've got the maximum number of points." That's quite rare in these competitions. So of course, I was over the moon, I was jumping around, and I went to my mom and told her, Mom, I got the maximum number of points. And I expected her to be happy. But she responded, in the prize ceremony, don't be too happy. And that's not because she didn't want me to be happy, but she was worried that my way of expressing happiness, intense happiness, would be seen as abnormal, weird, out of place, arrogant, whatever. So when I went to the prize ceremony and they called my name and asked me to stand up, I stood up, put on a polite smile, didn't know what to do with myself, sat down again. What does this have to do with engineering education? There are emotion norms in engineering education. Now I'd like to ask you to turn to your neighbor and very briefly share your experiences of what are appropriate or common emotions in engineering education and what emotions may not be that accepted. What are your experiences? All right. This is fantastic. I love you. So what does research say about emotion norms in Western, I have to add, engineering education? Emotions are typically not valued very highly. We value rational thought over emotional engagement. We value technical aspects over societal, political, humanistic concerns. We often see emotions actually as a threat to good technological development, because technological development has to be objective, and it's just the facts. There's no values or emotions in there. And emotions are seen as alien to technological work, to engineering work, because engineering solutions are just new technology. And I'm going to share an example from our own research. This is an interview I did with an engineering undergraduate student in 2012, so it's a while ago. But we talked about the extreme and acute water shortage in Jordan as a wicked problem of sustainability. And I asked the student, and we discussed what can we do about it? And the student had concluded that it's not possible to find a perfect solution. We can't make everybody happy. And the conclusion is, well, then we should just develop technology without asking people what they think and value, because they differ anyways. And then I asked him, do you think you can develop technology without taking a stance and without taking values and opinions into account? And here's what he answers. Engineers' decisions should be based on basic theory. I think that it should be more of a cold analysis of what actually happens. Can engineers relying on cold analysis be responsible? Hand up if your answer is yes. Good, solved. Here's my answer. I'm stealing a concept from post-human theory, and I've very freely translated it to engineering education language, so bear with me on that. The concept is responsibility. considering of responsibility as a capability, something we are able to do. We are able to be emotionally affected by other beings and to respond to the needs of those other beings in a situated way. So not a blueprint solution, like this group needs that, but interacting with humans, non-human beings, and responding in the way they need in that situation. If we think of responsibility in that way, if we want to educate responsible engineers, we have to allow students and educators to be human beings. They have to be allowed to have passions and fears and anxiety and experience pain and pleasure. They're unpredictable, creative, irrational miracles. And we have to allow them to be that. We have to prepare them for being emotionally affected and dealing with those emotions. And that can be in response to the state of the world, in social relationships, but it can also be in response to wicked problems that don't have a solution, and they don't know how to deal with that. We need to empower them to care about and for other beings, to turn emotions into action of care. And we need to prepare them to actually work together with other beings who also have emotions and their own needs. So all of this is not new, what I'm saying. The emotion norms of engineering education have been criticized for decades. The first quote is from 1975, Richard Mortensen, who said, "The engineering profession stands in need of a thorough self-scrutiny, particularly one which fearlessly takes into account non-technical and non-rational factors." 40 years later, Michael Davis has written about emotions and ethics and engineering, saying that he provides a critical examination of the view, common even among engineers, that a good engineer is not only accurate, laconic, orderly, and practical, but also free of emotion. So now when we come to research, emotions aren't supposed to be there. How do we research them? I'm going to tell you my story since 2010. It wasn't a straight path, but I'll tell you about it. I started in 2010 when I was still a student in engineering nanotechnology, but I was also involved in developing and teaching a course in sustainability for my peer students. And we were working with wicked sustainability problems. We challenged them with things that didn't have clear answers, uncertainty, ambiguity, value conflicts. And we noted that the students were frustrated. So after that, I wanted to do a PhD on trying to figure out how to deal with that frustration. What is that frustration about, and how can we help the students? 2 years later, I worked on trying to define perspective shift as a competence for being able to deal with wicked problems, and noted that we need not only factual thinking, normative and descriptive, we also need emotional thinking. 5 years later, I again noticed when I gave students wicked problems and asked them to deal with them, they were overwhelmed and frustrated. And another study where we tried to look at affective or emotional scaffolding, we noted inadequate support to deal with frustration. So what did we learn in those 10 years? Well, engineering students have emotions, and their emotions matter for learning. So what? We knew that before. So then the challenge comes, how do we actually get to researching the emotions and not just over and over realizing that they're there? Because I wanted to research emotions, but I hadn't been able to actually get to the emotions. I always circled around them. So this is what worked for me. I went to REES in Bogota 2017, where Nikki Surshaka held a keynote on empathy in engineering education. And it blew my mind. It's like, can you talk about empathy in engineering education? Can you do research on that? Does that mean I could be able to do it? So I talked to her after the keynote. I was like, how did you manage to do that? Like, what were the reactions? What pushback did you experience? What challenges? And when she talked about it, it sounded just like a normal research project. So that should be possible. Another thing that made it possible for me was resources, partly from our university, and then I got a fund from the Swedish Science Council as well that allows us to actually dive into the emotional aspects on a detailed level. But the most important part is community. This picture is from the second Emotions and Engineering Education Symposium in 2022. And it was just such a fantastic experience to be in a place with 30 people who are all interested in emotions and engineering education, talk about emotions for 3 days, be together and build that community. We also have like virtual coffee chats where we exchange ideas, and we've done a big research project in a group of 10 people that I'm going to talk about more now. We did a systematic review, because at the first symposium, we first wanted to develop a research agenda for research on emotions and engineering education. But then we realized, well, we don't actually know what the field looks like, because nobody knew of any other work. We were just a bunch of people that I threw together to talk about emotions. And we can't define a direction without knowing where we are. So we wanted to see, okay, well, what is the field like? And we did a configurative review, which means that we didn't try to summarize the results of the research because there wasn't enough good empirical research out there, but to see what kind of concepts and theories have been used to study emotions in engineering education. And we didn't expect to find a lot because we didn't know of a lot of studies. We were wrong. So our first search, we got over 2,000 unique records in the literature, and then we screened it and narrowed it down, but we still had 213 papers after this process for in-depth review. And now this data, this literature was retrieved in August 2020, and I did a new search a couple days ago very quickly, and it has increased by about 30% since then. So it's very much growing, and there's a lot more in the pipeline that will come out quite soon. So who are the authors? This is an important piece to know when you look at the literature in the field. For most of them, emotion was not their main research area. 88% of them had published one item in that pool of papers. And only 2% had published more than 3 items. They didn't plan to study emotions, the same way that I went around the pool all the time. They wanted to study something else and stumbled over emotions. Well, emotions are a thing. That's surprising. We write about it. But they didn't have the actual data focused on studying emotions because they didn't plan to. And the third thing is that most of them were on their own. We only found 2 groups of authors who actually published together several times, and 3% international collaborations. And in 32 of the countries included in our review, there were less than 5 authors. Then you're alone. And they also didn't really cite each other because they probably didn't know that there are others. So they did hard work. We have to realize that. When we looked at how they conceptualize emotions, we distinguish between emotion concepts, which can be specific emotions like anxiety or frustration, but it can also be like emotional phenomena. Emotional intelligence is the most common one we found, but I talked about emotion norms, emotional labor. So those are emotion concepts. And then we have emotion theories that more try to explain how emotions develop or how they relate to other emotions, how they affect learning, etc. And 45% of all publications did not apply any emotion concepts, which meant they relied on everyday understandings of emotions and just assumed that everybody has the same understanding of what emotions are. Now, that's a bit problematic because we know that there's a lot of cultural difference in how we express, interpret, and understand emotions. So there's a big risk of misunderstanding, and there's also a risk of lack of precision if we don't define what we're looking at. And then there's a quite big chunk that cites papers that talk about emotion concepts, but they don't apply those concepts. And I call that research washing, which can be even worse because we pretend to do something that is based on scientific concepts, but we're not. Another thing we found is that only 4% of the publication used any emotion theories, and all of them used cognitive appraisal theories, which basically focus on individual students or educators' emotions and their emotional management skills. And they can aim to, for example, look at how emotions impact academic performance. But there's a whole range of other theories around that hasn't been used. So the reason we need theory in this is that we want to avoid to build on popularized concepts. Like emotional intelligence is a very good example of that. There has been empirical research in psychology, but then Goleman has picked it up and popularized it, and most people actually cite Goleman and not the research base. We also need theory to avoid misalignment between what we say we want to study and what we actually do to study. And an example there that we saw is many people who studied emotional intelligence used existing surveys, which isn't a problem per se, but those surveys were designed to analyze personality traits, and they used them to study emotional intelligence as an ability, which is a very different thing. So here's the emotional intelligence. You see the lightest part on the slide is all kind of in the same family of concepts. It's emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, emotional management, regulation, and then a bit the broader concept, social-emotional competencies or skills. That's a big chunk of the literature. And then we have some on specific emotions. We have empathy, academic emotions, and affect and motivation. But the interesting thing is that more than half of all the publications used at least one of these few concepts. And if you remember before, I said 30% did not mention any emotion concepts. That leaves us with 14% that fully relied on other concepts than these. So we have a lot of room for expanding how we think about emotions and how we study emotions and what phenomena we study. One reason that is important is because many of the concepts we use today actually reproduce quite problematic views and can also reproduce social injustice. First, they conceptualize emotion as separate from cognition and bad for good engineering. They also conceptualize emotions as individual deficits. Students have wrong emotions. They react wrongly emotionally in teaching and learning situations. And those deficits have to be fixed by fixing those broken individuals, or as Mortensen, that I cited previously from 1975, he called engineers as emotional misfits that have to be fixed. Another issue is that these concepts focus on emotions as individual skills. So it's in the context of global competition where the strongest survive, the most emotionally intelligent will be successful, rather than actually collaborating with each other. And then the last part is that often emotions are associated with certain social groups. And then the fact that these groups are described as emotional is used as an excuse to exclude them from political decision-making, economic decision-making, etc. The angry minority trope you may have heard is like we talk about minority and when they're protesting, we say, oh, they're just angry, which devalues the claim to we need social justice. So instead of seeing them as responding to injustice, we see them as just being angry. We also need concepts and theories that allow us to see emotions not as a problem, but as resources for becoming more responsible. We can, for example, study how we can use emotions to facilitate understanding, support each other, how we build relationships, how we collaborate with each other, how we can make better, more ethical decisions in engineering development, how we can communicate our values to others, how we can understand the norms in a social context and the values and try to identify how we can counter some of the norms that we don't like, develop counter-normativity, and how we can take action to challenge unjust structures and practices. And on the slide, I've just added a couple of concepts to get you started if you want to explore some of these a bit more. There's a lot out there if you're interested in a broader range of concepts to look at emotions. Talked about concepts and theory. Next part of research, the methods. How can we see emotions? So we have the 5 components that I mentioned in the beginning. And each of those components has certain empirical signs that we can use to study them. The neurophysiology, we can look at sweating, we can look how if the people shake or measure their heartbeat, we can measure hormone levels. Motor expression, we can video record or observe how people use their bodies, what facial expressions they put on, how they move their body in the room. Subjective feeling is that we need to actually ask people, and they can talk about emotions, can say, I feel ashamed. That is what we call emotion discourse. Motivation can be about how we position ourselves in the room, how we move, how we position ourselves towards artifacts. And cognitive evaluation, again, is easiest with language. We can use value discourse, where we just evaluate something around us. Now I have a challenge for you, because in one of our recent data collection, we asked students to discuss their learning experiences after a group exercise, where we asked them to use Post-its and write together. And during that discussion, one student drew these and put them very clearly facing towards the camera, towards us. How do we analyze that? What is that? It's not the oranges having emotions. It's not the student having emotions. If you have an answer or suggestion, please let me know, because we don't know. All right. So there's a lot of potential for using a greater range of methods also in research on emotions in engineering education. This chart doesn't look very surprising. It's mostly how much of engineering education research is. But the interesting thing is that quantitative research is mainly descriptive statistics. We didn't find a lot of advanced statistics like multiple regression or structural equation modeling or explanatory analysis, but it was mostly quantifying which emotions are there and how much of them, or how good were the students at these socio-emotional skills, and maybe explore correlations between those variables. The qualitative research mainly focused on who experienced which emotions. It didn't focus on how we experience emotions or how we express emotions. Another important thing is that it often used self-report data. That means they asked somebody, how do you feel? And that person said, I feel happy. I feel frustrated. Now we know that that kind of data can be quite unreliable. So it would be really good to complement that kind of data with others. And then we have quite a bunch of non-empirical studies that often reiterate the point I've been making in the beginning. Emotions are a thing in engineering education, and we need to pay more attention. And there's also room for more elaborate theoretical development. I'm getting to the end. Why do we need more methods? Emotions are complex. They are social, psychological, physiological phenomena. And if we want to have a full holistic understanding of emotions, we need to integrate diverse perspectives and diverse types of data. Otherwise, we just get a slice of what emotions are, and we actually risk taking the wrong decisions in designing our teaching and learning activities. To conclude, how is it possible that we actually can research emotions in engineering education, despite the ranging emotion norms? First of all, we don't start from scratch. Other people have done work on this, both in engineering education research, but also a lot of work in science education research and the broader educational research literature. We can use emotion concepts and theories to concretize what we want to look at, so it doesn't become this diffuse, difficult to grasp thing, but we know what we actually want to study. We focus on emotions as our primary empirical interest. That will make everything so much easier, I promise. And we embrace the messiness of emotions, attending to all the different social, psychological, physiological dimensions, power relations, cultural context, etc. And we do it together with others and allow ourselves to be human beings in the process. Last point. These relevance. So the conference organizers have done such an amazing job creating a more inclusive atmosphere and conference. And I wanted to contribute a little bit to that. Speaking of emotion norms, conferences can be extremely exciting and energizing, but they can also be very draining. Like what I said, if you don't want somebody to talk to you, you have to tell them. So this is how you tell them, please, I need some space. Just put it in your arm and say, I'm full. I just need to be on my own for a little bit. Or if you want to talk to a lot of people, or maybe you're shy and you don't know how to approach, and maybe you're here for the first time, and you want people to help you and approach you, use that one. Thank you.